She's been active in the whole web, internet freedom space for a long time, and it isn't her first time speaking on the PDF stage, the founder of One Web Day. More recently, Susan was a special assistant at the White House working on national economic policy and technology and innovation, and she's going to talk to us about the future of broadband. And
Yep. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How are you doing?
Morning.
Good morning. So yesterday, Jimmy Wales, in response to a question about whether or not he was following Washington communications policy, said, "I make websites." I have to say, it was fair to say he was talking in a sort of a stiff manner. Websites me, government over there. And I have a lot of sympathy for that viewpoint. I was brought up, trained in the internet age by people who really believed that nation states were on the verge of crumbling, and that anything that a telephone company wanted to do or any other carrier, we could just geek around it. We could avoid it. That these people were just irrelevant, essentially. So I feel as if for the last 7 years, I've been learning a foreign language and traveling in a foreign country. And so I'm here to do a little translation for you. Here is my intellectual learning curve over the last few years. It was really stunning to find out just how many acronyms were involved in the world of the very few providers by whose grace each one of us has access to the internet. I also began to notice that there was an awful lot of merging going on. You may have thought we broke up AT&T in 1984. Well, I want to report to you that they've found a way to gather together once more, that we have essentially two gigantic telephone companies dividing the country among themselves. You also may not know that the cable providers have been consolidating, clumping their operations regionally, so that none of them competes with no other. They also have tremendous monopolies by franchise in each city where they serve. So lots of merging going on, no legal limits on their ability to discriminate. And what I'm really here to tell you about today is that we are in the course of a titanic battle for the future of the internet in the United States. That the technology community is radically underrepresented in this conversation, and that the Jimmy Wales response, "I make websites," is no longer appropriate or sufficient. It is unquestionably the case that the technology industry in this country contributes hugely to economic growth, to our promise of new ideas and new ways of making a living, and that side of the argument when it comes to an open internet is absolutely not being heard. I want to suggest to you that government has a role in providing an input. Just as Anish Chopra was talking about this morning, a government role in opening up data, that's a key government input. Another government role is providing a level playing field for innovators, for everybody who wants to make a living. So if you want to someday dump Facebook for its alternative competitor and make sure that that competitor is equally successful to Facebook, if you're worried about personalization, as Eli is at the application level, you should be very worried about personalization at the network level, because these carriers are convinced that monetization of internet applications and content is the only way they're going to survive. So here I'm going to turn the slide and give you a very brief encapsulation of what just happened in the communications policy world. I feel a little bit like at Tim O'Reilly conferences, there's a woman who's been giving a conference session about kale and how terrific kale is and how delicious it is and how you should all eat it and cook it. Well, this is telecommunications policy as the mental kale for you right now. You have to understand, and I'm sure many of you do, that the internet would not exist absent government regulation. That the fact that telephone companies were required to allow computers and modems to attach to their lines gave rise to the internet. If the companies, those telephone companies had understood the internet, they would have tried to monetize it. They didn't get the chance because the legal regime made the internet possible. When cable modems showed up on the scene in the mid-90s, the regulators were really confused. How do we treat this? You know, the cable companies have bonded a couple of their channels so that you'll get internet access over the same wires that are also providing you with 500 channels of content. So it seems to be traveling over the same path, but it's going to the internet. How do we treat that as a regulatory matter? Thinking that competition was right around the corner, that telephone companies would be battling it out with the cable providers, that broadband over power line was coming, that wireless carriers would be competing for our favor with internet access, the FCC completely deregulated high-speed internet access in 2002 and also in decisions in 2005, 6, and 7. And it did this by saying we're not going to label these services as a regulated service. We're taking away that label, but we're reserving the power to regulate later if we feel like it. And the FCC called that their ancillary jurisdiction. Well, you may have seen this in the papers recently. When Comcast was throttling BitTorrent back in the fall of 2007, FCC said that's unreasonable network management, and you've got to report to us about what you're up to. That whole step by the FCC very recently was found to be unlawful by our main regulatory court of appeals, the DC Circuit. Says this whole idea of labeling something a deregulated service and then regulating it makes no sense legally. You've got to think of another way to do this. So very recently, the chairman of the FCC has suggested relabeling high-speed internet access as a regulated service, but refraining from the heavy-handed regulation of telephone companies of the past. So we wouldn't impose on them things like rate regulation or unbundling. That's what we used to do to the old monopoly telephone companies, but we would require them not to discriminate. FCC is calling this the third way. Well, you would have thought that the FCC had completely gone around the bend based on the response to this move in the last couple of weeks by the incumbent carriers and their lobbyists. The analysts are calling this World War III. One analyst actually calls this the nuclear option. Just pause and think about this. Communications, high-speed internet access to the internet is the essential economic input of our age. These companies are arguing that it should have no oversight and not be regulated by any federal actor. So that's where we are, this titanic battle. What's at stake? I saw some comments on the Twitter feed about the importance of rural America. The FCC wants to be able to bring broadband to all Americans. They can only do this by classifying internet access as a regulated service. They need to be able to gather data. It's terrifying how much policymaking is basically done in the dark about high-speed internet access right now. They certainly want to make sure that there's a level playing field for the new applications, the joy, the effervescence, all of this of the internet, but also the economic growth that's made possible when you have a platform on which you can innovate without asking for permission. If you're worried about privacy at the network level and deep packet inspection, you'd want to have your regulator with the authority to talk to the gigantic companies involved who are interested in this. It's very good that AT&T is part of this session today because they're clearly trying to join the conversation to understand the internet era. I also want you to know that AT&T spent $6 million this quarter working on lobbying against any possibility of regulation of high-speed internet access, that they have ginned up the House to produce letters attacking the FCC for even thinking about this, that there is a definite campaign of personal destruction, if possible, being brought about by the incumbents. So there's a battle. We need your help. The technology sector needs to be part of this conversation and is not yet there. The FCC is doing its best to be constructive and to do the right thing. But this must feel very distant to some of you. I want to encourage you to find ways into this conversation and to make sure that your voices are heard. You may notice these last two bullet points. Comcast, in particular, spent $29 million during the first quarter of 2010, and this I find really stunning. They've hired 78 former government employees. What are all those people doing? Well, I'll tell you what they're doing. As of 2012, the FCC has told us that most Americans will have just one choice for their high-speed internet access provider. It'll be the cable monopoly. And they don't compete with each other. There will be one place to go. They've clustered their systems, and for each region, they have extraordinary market share. Verizon, faced with the need to provide Wall Street with reports of high dividends and lots of free cash flow, has decided to back off on their plans for Fios. That means there won't be another viable competitor to the cable monopoly in every major city in America. Right? For truly high-speed internet access, what you'll need for accessing video, there won't be another player. So we know that Comcast is suggesting merging with NBC. So there are only about 5 major content providers in the United States. NBC is one of them. Comcast is saying it would make sense to vertically integrate with them. Comcast itself is already the largest cable television company and our largest broadband company. Lots of concerns about this merger, and there is a public hearing to be held by the FCC on July 13th in Chicago. Make sure that your readers know about this. Make sure that everybody's paying attention. There are a lot of concerns about Comcast's potential ability to use the content that it adds together with its operations from NBC, particularly sports, to make sure that it's very difficult for other distributors of content to compete with Comcast. Lots of concerns about the nascent industry of online video. You know, it might be that we'd like to see sources of content other than the big 5, and that they should have a level playing field to work on. If Comcast is successful and able to discriminate, the future of online video has a tremendous shadow cast on it. Lots of worries on Comcast's side about avoiding cord cutting. Lots of worries about Comcast's ability to put all content over which it has control, which is going to be a lot, behind an authentication wall online. So as a condition of seeing things online, you'll have to be a cable subscriber, tying those two things together. I think a lot of you have noticed this with the cable industry: impenetrable bundles, ever-rising prices. You know, it's a great business to be in. It's just gravy. You set it up, and then the money keeps flowing. John Malone has a terrific quote about the Comcast-NBC merger. He was the guy running TCI back a few years ago, and is still very active now, snapping up companies in Europe. He suggested if Comcast can't rape and pillage, it's probably not a great investment. So another place where the tech community needs to be watching is over this particular merger. Just to show you what's up, lots of brands being combined. This is from Comcast's own materials. Here, you know, you can't read this, and there's a reason for that. I just wanted to show you just how many things are combined in this merger. It's a tremendously large deal, and it's the first of many. All of the network providers and the content companies are convinced that vertical integration is the way to go, that they won't survive, they won't be able to attract investment without this. So this is just a brief talk. I wanted to make sure that you were aware of these battles going on, and that you didn't take high-speed internet, open high-speed internet access for granted. This today is the 500th day of the President's administration, and he's hard at work, doing the best he can, battling the forces of an oil company that has not been adequately supervised and is pouring oil into the Gulf. Inadequate federal oversight may have played a significant role in this tragedy, which is affecting millions of lives. More than 100 years ago, Americans hated another oil company, and that oil company's name was Standard Oil. And Standard Oil, in cahoots with the railroad companies, who had also divided up the country among themselves, was able to control regional production of oil. It was only being produced in northwestern Pennsylvania at that point, and carry out lots of practices that enraged the small business people, farmers, and even rock-ribbed Republicans of the day. Let's look at what Standard Oil was able to do. They could make sure that the railroad companies provided them with rebates so that their material would ship more cheaply than their competitors. They also had a practice they called drawbacks. If a railroad company shipped the products of a different oil company, not Standard Oil would get paid. How about that? Just think about that for a second. Your competitor ships something, I get paid. And finally, Standard Oil was famous for carrying out industrial espionage, making sure that the railroad companies gave them information about everybody else's shipments, so they would be able to underprice, squeeze, and in other ways get rid of competition in their markets. Like the electric grid, which is giving rise to the Chevy Volt, like the internet itself, which only came out of regulated industry, the future of high-speed internet access depends on government creation of a level playing field. This should not be anathema to the tech community. In fact, we should be celebrating, embracing, and doing our best to collaboratively ensure that high-speed internet access remains the essential input open field utility that it is. So remember Jimmy Wales' comment. Think to yourself, do I make websites? Am I going to be able to make websites in the future? And don't take any of this for granted. Thank you very much.